Yeah, so last time we talked, we discussed events in Europe in the 19th century, up basically from the end of Napoleon's conquests and defeat to the civil unrest that happened in 1848, in the middle of the 19th century. I uh, I want to say that a lot of these events that happened in 1848, 49, 50, they were political in such a way that they sort of set the stage for the transformations that would happen in the period we're talking about now. France changed; it was going to change a lot. Germany was going to change a lot, and Italy was going to change a lot. And as a consequence of those three shifts, everywhere else in Europe would change a lot too. So, without any further ado, I'll hand it over to my guest, Evan Loganov. Evan, what do you think about this so far?
Okay, I think we talked a little bit about the revolutions of 1848 in our last series that was from Napoleon to 1848, but the main revolutions were Austria and France, like I said at the end, but there were also kind of uprisings in Italy. They didn't get, too much done in those, but they kind of signaled, a lot of, kind of unrest about the status quo, about that. And like the Kingdom of Two Sicilies, kind of, was one that was kind of a little weakened by that. And then they had like Piedmont, Sardinia, which was the one that ultimately would unite them.
Yeah. We'll see, of course, the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies break apart in the period we're discussing today.
Yeah. And there are also ones in Switzerland, Sweden, Romania, Hungary, Belgium had some, and those were more minor.
And these are all
did signal that.
Yeah. Sorry, you cut out. What are you saying?
Those were more minor. The ones in the other states, like France and Austria, were the biggest.
Yeah, and they're all liberalizing reforms. Essentially, there's feminist elements, abolitionist elements, even anarchical elements, just like progressive elements in all these revolutions. That while they didn't always have like lasting impact, they set a precedent for future revolutions that would have more of a reorganizing value. I'd like to talk a little bit about the Crimean War because it's not a war that a lot of people in the U.S. know keenly about. But the Crimean War was kind of one of the defining wars of the mid 19th century for its ability to bring European powers together and get them to focus on something that was sort of outside of their typical sphere of influence. In this case, they went all the way into the Ottoman Empire's realm and looked at a political dispute that was going on in occupied Jerusalem about whether or not Orthodox Christians should, have authority there, or if Catholic Christians should have authority there. Well, of course, the French wanted, the Western powers entirely, French and British, wanted Catholic power there, and so did the Ottomans. The Russians, however, wanted Orthodox power there, and so this whole kind of very large scale war. I won't call it a world war, but it's beyond like a continental Europe, and it's a war that doesn't really seem very like pertinent to the American perspective. But if you actually look at it closely, this is right before the American Civil War, and the themes are kind of similar. Like we have Russia is sort of like this established European country that has a lot of opinions about how things should be run, but then you have the elite Europeans in England and France trying to boss them around, and then they end up winning, and it all has to do with people who are of color, right? Ottomans in this case, and helping their cause. So it was sort of like a proxy war for a social issue, and it wasn't really about Like it doesn't really seem like it was about the economy so much. Then we have, a huge crisis in Austria. France actually looks very in control of things by comparison to Austria. In our last podcast, we talked about how France was sort of gaining power over Austria, and this is very true even now. I mean, France has all these colonial possessions that are just kind of racking up over time. It's becoming a very strong colonial force, whereas Austria is becoming less and less relevant. And we see this in the war in 1866, where the Austrians basically have a civil war against the northern Germans. And, this is the same time, roughly, as the American Civil War. And it actually has a similar North and South dichotomy going on, where their two confederations are struggling for predominance. Obviously, the Austrians are based out of Vienna, and the Germans are based out of Berlin. And eventually this leads to Germany not being forming completely, but it secedes from Austrian control. And so Germany effectively secedes during this time when, in the American Civil Wars, they just had a war over secession. The secessionists lost. But in Europe, the secessionists won. It's kind of ironic. And then, of course, as a consequence of this war, which has been called the 7 Weeks' War, the German Civil War, or the Austro-Prussian War, the consequence of this war is also that Italy kicks Austrian forces out of Venice. And the hegemony that the Austrian Empire had over Italy is basically like curtailed for good. And so that, of course, will lead into the Italian unification, because with Austria out of Italy in a very powerful way, in a very substantial way, it's lost so much power. Essentially, Italy is free to do as it pleases. Evan, I think you have something to say about that.
I thought you were going to do the Italian. I would do the German.
Oh yeah, I can do the Italian. But
just one more note on the Crimean War.
Yeah.
A lot of not just political changes, but also social changes came from that, particularly in regards to medicine, the kind of modern,
Florence Nightingale.
Florence Nightingale. Well, I say the modern nursing profession was born out of the Crimean War.
Yeah, in fact, more people died from lack of antiseptic care than they did from actual combat. It was a very disgusting.
That was the case in most wars before then.
Yeah, you're probably right, but in this case, it was especially heinous, and so there was a cause for it to be, this problem be relieved, because, what happens is like they neglect it so much, and to the point where it bubbles up and it just explodes all over the place. And I think this war is sort of known for its lack of medical care more than any other war.
Yeah, you can get to the Italian unification.
Yeah, and so the Italian unification, we have an early attempt at unifying Italy with a guy called Giuseppe Mazzini. He was sort of a diplomat, statesman guy. He inevitably fails, but it sets a precedent for unification. And the Kingdom of Sardinia Piedmont was independent, pre-existing to all these this time period. And what happened with them was their king wanted to unify Italy. He didn't really know how to without just invading. And so eventually, but what happens is that in southern Italy, Sicily is is tied to the Kingdom of Two Sicilies, otherwise known as the Kingdom of Naples. Because remember, for hundreds of years, Naples by itself is kind of like a powerful kingdom. And it's basically all of southern Italy, the whole boot, half the boot, and then Sicily as well. Sicily is tired of this, though. And the Sicilians rebel, and then they get a guy called Garibaldi. Was it Giuseppe Garibaldi? Yes, Giuseppe Garibaldi. Yeah, and he was a freedom fighter in South America, actually, because they had all these rebellions against the Spanish Empire that happened in the 1820s. And he was a freedom fighter in South America, so he had a lot of experience doing this kind of guerrilla warfare, a little bit like a Che Guevara figure before there was one. And he really invaded Italy, went from town to town with armies, gathering forces, a true revolutionary, and got all these people to unify under an independent, unified Italy. And he was stopped and imprisoned, and various places didn't really need his help. They were doing, he wasn't like, he didn't do all of it on his own. But there were quite a few people who did, there were quite a few people who did help unify Italy, but none of them were as brave and as charismatic as Garibaldi. He was sort of the spirit and mascot for this movement.
Okay, I'll get to German unification. Okay, so first we'll have to go through some history with Napoleon. Napoleon was one of the primary factors for German unification was the most powerful kingdom, and the one that would ultimately end up unifying them was Prussia, and that was under Otto von Bismarck. And but the way they got unified is kind of interesting. First of all, Germany was a confederation of different states, kind of like similar to like the United States Articles of Confederation before the Constitution. And there was like the North German Confederation and like Bavaria and a bunch of these others with these different states with like principalities. But before that, there were like both after the Napoleonic War, there were a bunch of different wars. The most important was the Franco-Prussian War. And that was a war that when Prussia kind of led the Germans into victory, like over France, because France was considered like one of the most powerful. A lot of people did not think the Germans would be able to win. And when the Germans did win, then that kind of made Bismarck a lot more like popular, and he was able to use that to ultimately create a unitary state out of these different principalities, like in the North German Confederation. But like it was kind of like a merger, but Prussia was clearly the dominant one behind that. And a little more into Bismarck, he actually he was like very conservative in temperamentality, but ironically, he was the one who kind of started a lot of the modern, what we call the welfare state, started like universal health care, pensions, social security, stuff like that. And the reason he did that after he unified Germany was to take influence away from the socialists, because the social democratic parties were then saying, hey, we're going to promise you all these, good things. And that was their main draw to like the working class. And he said, no, I'm just going to provide this. And I'm in your I have the nationalist part too. So these are just, dirty, commies. And he basically, and another thing he did was he kind of started, this was a little bit ill-advised, but he started kind of what's called the Kulturkampf, the culture war against the Catholic Church, because a lot of the church institutions were not going along with a lot of what he said. And so he was definitely a very important figure in history, and like he's kind of what led Germany to the path they were in World War I and II. But I guess that would be what I said about Bismarck.
Yeah, Bismarck is an incredible organizer and political force in German history. There's almost no one quite like him. He had a famous Iron and Blood speech where he basically compares Germany, or Prussia really, unfavorably to the Western colonial powers. And he's like, we're not going to like have these impressive colonies and legacies that can get us like to be a first-rate nation. We can only become a first-rate nation through iron and blood. And that kind of was almost like a sparking point for the Industrial Revolution in Germany, or at least the mainstay of it.
Germany did take colonies like Tanzania and other places.
Technically, they had some, but they were not. It didn't compare. It paled in comparison. They had some in like far out in China too.
We'll get to imperialism a little later.
So then the thing with the German unification was they had a war that sort of like announced and brought money into the fund to fund the unification process. And that was the Franco-Prussian War of 1871, and obviously Otto von Bismarck is the chancellor, but we have two other leaders in this effort, known as Helmut von Moltke, who is a field marshal, and Albert von Brunn, who is also a field marshal. And you'd think like, two field marshals, what's the difference? Well, one of them is a strategist, and the other one is more of an organizer or a logistics guy. And these guys are really smart. They used the railroad system. Actually, Moltke worked in the as a railway executive, like in the early in like the incipient phase of the railroad empires, and so he was an executive, and then he became a general, and then he used his knowledge of that industry to kind of couple it with the army, so that they could field troops in these rail cars in a way that no other nation was doing at the time, and made them so much more efficient in terms of delivering troops to battlefields and making the borders secure and so on. They had a famous battle against the French called the Battle of Sedan, and the French were just kind of losing their shit at this period. The cause for this war was so minor that it was almost like a staged war. There was a letter that they believed was forged that they pretended that wasn't forged, the Germans, I mean, and they blamed the French for something. And it was kind of a bullshit war, honestly. But what was interesting is that the French at this time were so in such, depraved conditions that they actually had an uprising in their capital in Paris, known famously now as the Paris Commune, and
It didn't last too long, but it was
2
still
months.
kind of notable.
Yes, 2 months, but it helped reshape French politics forever. And of course, at the end of this war, there's insane indemnities that the French have to pay to the German victors. It's very bad for their economy. They lose Alsace-Lorraine, which is a breadbasket, an industrial powerhouse in France at the time. And Germany gets a lot of money, and that really helps them, bring a lot of pride and, wealth to their unification movement. And so Germany is now an actual country. Before this, Germany was never even a country, like in any real sense.
And virtually no one expected Germany to win the Franco-Prussian War. It was a huge surprise and like a shock.
Yeah, and actually, the French had such a strong military tradition because of Napoleon and all this, even though that was decades earlier, about 50 years, more than 50 years. They even though they had this really strong military tradition, they didn't really do any upkeep with it because they didn't really care about the science and that was going on. They were very interested in culture and being pompous, and so when the weapons they had were so crummy, and they just thought it was, and you'll see this in World War I eventually, is that the French just at this period in their history did not try to modernize their army. It was like a second thought almost.
And they also had a kind of invasion of Mexico that they tried to expand their colonies into the kind of the New World. I guess the United States was actually in support of it, but it kind of went really disastrously. The prince they wanted to install got killed and everything.
That was
kind of like
the pastry war.
A very bad move,
Yeah, that one was a blunder, and they called that the pastry war. And it was Napoleon III tried to do that. It's a Napoleonic effort, but a terrible one. And also in this period we have we see some other colonial things going on. I think Spain and France starts to look at Morocco quite a bit, and to divide it up between them. We also see that the Britain it goes to war against Egypt.
This is the birth of the British Empire, kind of like a little bit later, the mid 1800s and Victorian age.
Yeah, well, the British,
it became what it was.
The British, speaking of Britain, we haven't even talked about Britain. They had several very good prime ministers. William Gladstone, Benjamin Disraeli, who was the first and only prime minister to have Jewish descent. Although he was actually the founder of the Conservative Party, so it's kind of ironic. But
the Conservatives then kind of embraced what's called the kind of one nation Toryism, which was basically it combined actually some elements of welfare statism, kind of the idea that the upper class have like a sort of responsibility to care for those in the lower class. And
it's fascinating.
That was just kind of
Yeah, you wish we'd love to see that in America now, but yeah.
There were also plenty of social movements in Britain at the time. It's just they weren't as violent as what other things. One of the main ones was Chartism, which was basically an attempt to make all male suffrage, which was considered a very weird, kind of like unprecedented thing at the time. Like you usually had to have some like property value. They didn't really get all male suffrage, but they did pass several were able to kind of influence the passage of several reform bills that expanded the franchise in Britain. That made it one of the most democratic countries in Europe.
There's quite a bit of legal reform, and in England and France specifically. Other countries less so, but England and France were really the spearheading legal reform in terms of empowering common people. What I find so interesting about this phase for Britain in the Victorian era, of course, is that they're really starting to build up colonies that are not like where they just kind of jump around and control giant nations of people. India has already been built up quite a bit at this point, but and actually Wellington, we talked about last time, was instrumental to that, but that was neither here nor there. I mean, India is a very prosperous colony at this point for Great Britain. The one that fascinates me though is Egypt, because obviously they were controlled by the French back in the last podcast, but the reason the British went to war against the Egyptians was because they loaned them a bunch of money. William Gladstone even gave them a lot of his private fortune. So like almost a third of his entire private fortune he gave to them, expecting them to pay it back. The government never paid them back. So they went to war literally just to get money, like because they were because of debt. And then they ended up just conquering the whole place. Reminds me a little bit of what's going on with China and the United States right now, although hopefully it's not as bad as that.
The other thing we should mention, kind of going back to the unification of Germany and Italy, is that at this time, Italy, when it was united, there was a large inequality between the north of Italy and the south of Italy. The south of Italy was much poorer, much less industrialized. It was like heavily
agrarian
crime and a bunch of other stuff. It was heavily filled with crime, and people knew it was dangerous. So, and the same thing with the kind of poorer states of Germany. So during this time, a lot of people actually started moving to the United States or other places in the Western, in the West, like the New World. And that was kind of it was called the Great Exodus, kind of basically from Europe. A lot of, particularly Poland, Germany, and Italy. At that time, that's when a lot of people moved.
Yeah, no, and I believe Italy had a cholera epidemic in the south, largely because just the healthcare was so poor. Obviously in Ireland you have the potato famine, the blight.
They lost most of their population either to just moving out, or I think over half towards the death.
Yeah, it's an interesting situation in a lot of a lot of the Germans. There's actually a lot of Germans in America because of that moved from Germany during this period. My ancestors, some of them are moved over during this period, so it was a real phenomenon. What I always like about the mid 1800s is the explosion of literature that was going on. I mean, you have it in the early 1800s and for sure in the last 10 years or so, but the mid 1800s is sort of like the sweet spot for literature. And you have Turgenev in Russia with Dostoevsky and War and Peace from the Tolstoy, and obviously Dostoevsky, Crime and Punishment. Golden age of Russian literature, and a great age for in England too. I mean, you had Charles Dickens, you have George Eliot, you have John Ruskin.
One of the things that was kind of unique about Charles Dickens was he centered his stories on lower classes, which most authors, famous authors, would not do.
And that was a novelty.
Were relatively high up, yeah.
And then in France, you have Gustave Flaubert, Guy de Maupassant, Victor Hugo is the most famous. Yeah, and who's that guy that I always like to talk about? Honoré de Balzac, my favorite French author. Yeah, so really an amazing time for French letters as well. In Germany, they had in Germany and Italy, I don't associate with literature during this period. They had the Goethe and Friedrich Schiller and all of that, but that was way earlier. And then in Italy, they had, obviously they had political stuff, clamoring for reform and so on. But this wasn't an era that was characterized by, prose writing in Italy. I think it's more characterized by opera. significantly so. You have Giuseppe Verdi. A lot of people named Giuseppe actually are making their mark during this period. And you have who's the other guy? You see, I don't know opera that well, but not Puccini. Puccini was later, just in case you thought. He he was actually 20th century.
Getting into like physical art, you have to mention Romanticism. That movement. I think we may have mentioned it briefly in the last one, but
Wait. Let me. Rossini. Sorry. Okay. So you have Rossini. You have Verdi. This is a romantic era for opera. But then you also have composers like Tchaikovsky, very romantic. Wagner, extremely romantic. Wagner was the greatest exponent of German opera. He wrote revitalized medieval traditions. A fun fact about literature in Germany during this period, in the Romantic period, was that because of all the devastation that happened in previous wars, and like for instance the 30 Years' War is kind of the main one, the medieval hamlets that were supposed to be all over Germany in the countryside, they were destroyed by plague and fires and nasty sort of war-related events, epidemics. And so that whole culture was kind of destroyed, at least architecturally. And they were so in the Romantic period in the 1800s, which is the period we're talking about now, they wrote a lot about like the medieval German situation just out of nostalgia, because they felt like they had lost so much connection with it after all these decades of warfare.
And the Brothers Grimm, they had like people like the Brothers Grimm who like made what we know modern day as fairy tales.
Brothers Grimm.
The tales actually came from earlier, but they
yeah, no, the Brothers Grimm are a great example. That's more of like it's not high literature, but it's that same medieval nostalgia.
Culture.
Yeah, culture. And then of course you have what I was saying about Wagner is that he came up with this concept of Gesamtkunstwerk, and that means like absolute art, total art, and it's a way of unifying dance with singing. It was employed in opera, but it combines dance, singing, acting, visual arts, musical compositions, orchestration. It combines all of it into one visual narrative. And he actually used a lot of his the stories of Parsifal by Eisenbach from the Middle Ages. He tried to revitalize these like extant medieval stories and bring it into the aristocratic realm. Whereas I think the Brothers Grimm, was more of like something written for the common person in a kind of a folksy sort of way.
Let's get into some like the changes and social changes at the time.
Yeah, there's a big. What was the big? I always forget this one, but I mean, obviously they're trying to get rid of capital punishment. They're trying to get rid of corporal punishment.
Yeah. This was the era where the modern prison developed. Basically, the modern kind of court, well, not modern, but like basically before then, a lot of them would happen. Like if they did it, sometimes they had dungeons and other things like that, but most of the time, punishment was either capital punishment, severe corporal punishment, or exile and stuff like that. And this was when the kind of modern, penal system developed in that sort of way in a lot of these countries, those by social reformers.
Yeah, I could see that. Yeah, and they also the sort of the development of a police state also coincided with that a bit. I mean,
the gendarmerie and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's an interesting period. It's very there's a lot of urbanization going in parallel with the modernization. It's almost like they're kind of you get one, you can't have one without the other. It's sort of how it feels.
Another thing was advances in medicine. So two figures that kind of epitomize this, or just not really medicine so much as hygiene, were Louis Pasteur and Jon Snow, not the character from Game of Thrones, but they kind of tried to kind of figure out hygiene and like what caused diseases and stuff like that. And a lot of people were pretty in the dark before then. They didn't know, and a lot of times believed in like really superstitious stuff about like what caused diseases. And they kind of like developed the kind of modern ideas of hygiene and pasteurization, which was what Louis Pasteur did.
Yes.
And basically, like it didn't wipe out disease, but it definitely they knew there was a lot more knowledge of what caused it, and it ultimately over time led to a lot of these diseases going down.
Louis Pasteur, is kind of an enigma because he's a French scientist in an era where there's a lot of German and British industrial research going on, but he did something in microbiology and bacteriology, and he is kind of the most important scientist in this era because because of his ability to disinfect common milk and dairy poultry items, eggs and things. Like just this idea that you need to like simmer something for a little bit in order and do it at a mass scale, an industrial scale. That was really like almost like the most important scientific thing you could think of in this area. Obviously, you have in Germany you have Helmholtz, and you have Ludwig von Boltzmann, but then in England you have James Clerk Maxwell and Michael Faraday. I always think of Louis Pasteur as being the most important scientist, and that's not not forgetting Darwin and Alfred Lord Wallace.
I'm talking about like scientists were like they could be used in real life. Darwin was probably one of the most important ever in terms of like the social changes.
For social, but it was not the same as inventing something that was practical.
Yeah, no, definitely not.
And it's interesting.
Darwin,
yeah.
A lot of people think there was this like huge fire and pitchfork kind of religious reaction to Darwin, and it came. It wasn't really that. Like it was either kind of either ignored, treated as an oddity, or a lot of religious people said, oh, it could even be incorporated into their beliefs, And there was a social reaction with the development of things like social Darwinism or survival of the fittest, the kind of ideologies that people used to justify sometimes racist ideas then.
He was a man that was sensitive to his time, and he knew how to write to it, directly at it. He wasn't, he wasn't a freak, and he. I honestly think that a lot of that evolutionary thought of his came from his grandfather Erasmus Darwin to some extent. You also have ideas in geology that were popular. Charles Lyell believed that the Earth slowly evolved, and this was kind of informing the biologists at this time. And then you have even Lamarck, who had a famous early version of evolution that was not it was criticized, but that even informs Darwin as well. And not to mention that Darwin did most of his work in South America as his exploration, but there's scientific exploration going on in Southeast Asia with Alfred Lord Wallace, and he neither of these guys were knighted, which is interesting because I'm sure nowadays if anyone did anything of this stature, they would be knighted. But back then, these were the biggest scientists in Britain. They weren't granted anything by the crown. And Wallace is interesting because he was of a lower station than Darwin, so he didn't get the rewards that Darwin got. But he was also he was very curiously sort of conservative. He was like an anti-vaccine proponent back way back when, right? I mean, we're dealing with that now, but Wallace was doing that way back then. It's kind of an odd thing to even think was happening in the 1800s. And then he wrote his big book 10 years after Darwin wrote on the origin of species. He wrote his book, The Millite Archipelago. And so there was a sense that he was sort of second-rate version of Darwin. But the reality is that he came up with, his theory of evolution at the same time as Darwin.
Another huge social change that happened at the period was the kind of class changes. And the primary one was kind of like the traditional kind of landed aristocracy started to see their power wane a lot, and I mean a lot. There was a merchant class had existed for centuries, ever since kind of the Renaissance. It kind of been what you would call a proto sort of capitalist class of merchants, either small or big. There was always kind of a situation where they knew their place, that they were below the aristocracy, and that everything they had was kind of just because of the aristocracy left them. But then this began to change. The aristocracy started to decline, sort of the nobility and aristocracy started to decline dramatically, and then that was kind of when the captains of industry and trade sort of took over the helm as the kind of leading economic forces in society.
I think it was the failure of the aristocratic a system that led to all the abuses of
This was
democracy.
Napoleon.
Well, no, I mean, yeah, there was a layer of that then too. However, I think even when they were devising these republican systems of governance, right? They're like, oh, we're gonna have a republic of Germany, a republic of France, third and fourth French republics. United States is a republic, right? Like they were trying to base it off of the Roman Republic, but the Roman Republic was like designed to cater to the aristocrats. It wasn't meant for the people, the common people. So it was almost like it was like a halfway step between a full democracy, direct democracy, and an aristocratic government, or informally we could call it an aristocracy. So the republic system, it seems, is an enigma to me, because it's not quite a full blown aristocracy, but it's not really meant for the people at the lowest station.
Yeah, definitely. And another thing, what happens on the kind of lower end is with the kind of labor movement. So before, how a lot of people in crafts would organize was in things called guilds, which were basically associations which would control the kind of the crafts in this particular area. They declined a little bit around the kind of Renaissance, but they still maintained influence in a lot of areas, like kind of monopolizing their particular sector. But they basically became non-actors a lot of the times after industrialization, and then kind of a lot of these sort of like workers went to work for huge, sort of larger companies, and that's when a lot of the modern, what we call labor unions, were formed, and they had very mixed reactions depending on where they are. Britain a lot of places they were really suppressed. Britain kind of learned they had to tolerate them, in order to have kind of domestic tranquility. They gave them some rights to, negotiate, but the labor movement and the socialist movement were separate, but they were intertwined. Like most socialists didn't see it as like the end goal of having unions. They saw them just as a means to the end of like the kind of building of their own society.
Yeah, wasn't it this period famous for obviously Karl Marx was still alive, Frederick Engels, but wasn't this period famous for kind of people starting to pick up on socialist ideas?
Definitely. I mean, they didn't. I mean, you have to wait till the 20th century for them to get actual political power, but they started to gain a lot of influence then, especially like the Social Democratic parties in Germany.
What I often see is the arts and craft movement, the pre-Raphaelite movement, and there's a connection between romantic movements in art and socialist movements in politics, and there seems to be like this common thread.
Romanticism was embraced by a wide variety of political ideologies.
Yeah, but in this period, though, it seems like Romanticism starts to take more of a socialist turn, and you can see this in the textile works of William Morris. You can see this in the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. Dante Rossetti and his sister Christina Rossetti, and you can see it with the writings of John Ruskin, who did not like classical art. He really thought classical columns and friezes and sculpture, statuary, and all that. He thought that was all like very like brutal, and it didn't reflect like the natural state of things. And this movement, we see this manifest in the hippie movement in the '60s, the free love.
Oh, yeah, that's much later.
But this was the seed for that countercultural trend that was sort of anti-industrial, anti-Western.
Yeah, one of the weirdest would probably be a guy named Charles Fourier. He was like a socialist who had some very weird ideas.
Was he also the mathematician, or is it a different Fourier?
He's a utopian, and you had what?
Was he also the mathematician Fourier, the physicist, or is it that's a different?
Fourier.
Okay, let me which Fourier. No, I know who you're talking about, but there's also another Fourier. Joseph Fourier. Okay, yeah. So go on, yeah.
And you so basically there are multiple types of what you call socialist movements. There were utopian socialists, kind of a lot of these people kind of basically hippies. They said, oh, we should just go and make these communities. We'll all share things. Kind of New Harmony, Pennsylvania was one of Indiana. They went to the United States. I think there was this what was his name? He was a Scottish sort of. He was an industrialist, and then took his money to make his own sort of community, and it didn't last too long. But it's still around today as a town. There are also anarchists who kind of like could be considered just socialists who didn't associate with a party. They kind
I
of,
believe Charles
considered
Fourier
that,
invented the word feminism, correct?
He did, yeah. Uh, socialism was the word socialism was invented by what was his name? He was actually earlier as what's his name?
I think Charles Fourier died quite earlier than this period we're talking about, but he's still extremely relevant. I mean, almost more relevant than Marx would be.
So it was mostly a movement of intellectuals more than action in the early years of its existence, but it ultimately gained a huge following later.
Yes, utopian socialism. It sort of sounds silly, but it actually was very popular.
Should we go to like Eastern Europe and talk about like a lot of stuff on there?
The sort of the decline of the Ottomans, or you can go for it. I don't know much about it.
Okay, so I guess Russia would probably be the biggest thing. This was still during the time of the Tsars, and I mean, they were still very, they didn't really liberalize that much in Russia. I mean, they were still very, sort of authoritarian, and there were also kind of, a lot of unrest around Hungary and Romania, that area. There was they kind of had some border disputes, Romania was, I think, still part of the Ottomans then, but there's not many major political events that go on in Eastern Europe at that time, but it's kind of there's kind of tension building up to some.
Yeah, Romania has a hard go with the Ottoman Empire, and obviously you had, Matthias Corvinus in Hungary, and you have in Wallachia, you have Vlad the Impaler as resistors to the Ottomans. But by and large, the Ottomans kind of just ran, just kind of ran a rampage on those countries. I was baffled to find out that the Romanian alphabet, which is basically is Latin, but the Romanian script and language was never even found in a manuscript until the 1500s. They didn't even have a manuscript in Romanian. It's a fairly new language for literature, and their society is. I feel like it's almost like a young country, like Romania. Like it's not even like an established country, really.
Yeah, definitely. This was kind of later, but the Balkans would have a huge eruption against the Ottomans. I mean, the non-Greek Balkans, but the Greek already had independence.
Yeah, the Greeks. Yeah. We could hardly call Greece the Balkans, but they did have similar rebellions around the same time. And you're talking about Serbia. You're talking about maybe Albania, or
that was kind of There were uprisings that would ultimately have an uprising that would gain independence, but not until like the early 1900s. But there were definitely a ton of tension around that time between them, because they saw what happened in Greece and they wanted, kind of.
Well, yeah. I mean, another thing is that the Crimean War, the Austrians were supposed to be allies with the Russians, and then they backed out. And so when the Austro-Prussian War came around, the Russians did not want to help the Austrians. They actually fought against them, and so that was another reason why Austria declined, is because the Russians didn't want to ally with them after they felt like they were betrayed.
Yeah, the Crimean War, the main reason they got involved was not because they loved the Ottomans. I mean, the Ottomans had been the enemies of Europe for a long time, and ever since they're kind of only stopped from conquering Europe from the Siege of Vienna in the 1600s, but they were just afraid of Russia getting too much.
1683.
They were kind of on the rise. Yeah.
Yeah, no, they didn't want. They did not want Russia to take over, to dominate, really, which is funny. I mean, I guess they thought the Russians were going to be like Napoleon or something, because they sort of won against Napoleon. They're the biggest empire in terms of having an emperor and all that. But and I believe Nicholas the First. And that, by the way, back then the Tsar is Alexander the First, just to clarify. But I think the Tsar in this period was Nicholas the First, and he was actually almost like a patron in a way. Like, he was very open to arts and stuff. He wasn't against. I mean, they still had serfdom in Russia, but at the same time, there was like prominent bourgeois sort of artists like Dostoevsky and who's my favorite, and also Turgenev and Tolstoy. It's almost like a period similar to the period of Catherine the Great. She was a patron of Diderot, who wrote his encyclopedia in part in St. Petersburg. But we don't want to. No one ever talks about Nicholas the First. Like he's not like a household name, but it was under his administration, at the very least, that all those great books were written.
Want to get like some of the religious aspects?
Sure.
Okay, so basically, like a lot of the religious changes on the time, there was religion had been in kind of decline. Its influence on society writ large had been in decline since the 30 Years' War, especially the Catholic Church. I mean, it remained really influential in society, if not so much politics. But this time, a lot of it started. It was definitely overwhelmingly religious, but it started, especially among like middle classes, it started to decline a lot. Definitely, just social attitudes liberalized. I mean, even like they talk about the Victorian era basically being like, oh, prudish morality. But people don't realize that was mostly among the upper classes that kind of attitude was taken. Lower middle classes, there was a lot more liberalized attitude, and also the Catholic Church. I mean, only barely hold on to the Papal States after Napoleon was basically after Garibaldi conquered Italy. So and then Italy then was not it was still a Catholic influence.
Yeah, there's a fun fact about Garibaldi is that he was actually on the run at one point, and he hid in San Marino, which is now a country, right, a small country, and he was never found there. And so when he got out, he thanked the leader of San Marino by never incorporating it into the country of Italy. So it's still independent, just as a thank you from Garibaldi.
Yeah, but so one of the things that the Catholic Church, I mean, no surprise, didn't really like a lot of this, not just because they were losing political influence, but because like social attitudes were liberalizing, and one of the popes released this document called the Syllabus of Errors. It basically says like, that there's authority outside of the church, that a bunch of others, like basically things we'd all consider just modern sort of just regular liberal values. He denounced in this. Basically, this is like one of the first official documents that they did in that kind of idea.
Yeah, I mean the obviously like, both the Catholic situation got very weakened when the Papal States were minimalized in terms of border control, but then also you see the Greek Orthodox Church is sort of in the same boat. It's more of a presence in the European theater now, but it's because of the release from the Ottomans. But it's not. It's very very cloistered. It's not like it has no imperial association anymore. And that's probably true of the Catholic Church as well. I mean, all these imperial associations, these associations that the old world had with the big church, it doesn't. They're gone at this point.
Well, yeah, the Catholic Church is basically. I'm not saying they're totally lost influence, but as a political player, they basically lost most of their influence. Let's get to kind of colonization. I think that'll be the last part to do.
Oh, you know what? Okay. I was actually mistaken. It wasn't Tsar Nicholas the First or the Second that presided over this, a golden age of Russian literature. It was actually Tsars Alexander the Second and Alexander the Third, which means
Alexander the Second. He was assassinated by anarchists while he was on a train, and he became kind of a symbol for Russia to crack down even more on social reform movements when he was assassinated.
I could see why. I mean, he was known as the liberator. He had a positive reputation among many, and he abolished corporal punishment. But what's interesting is that this means that in the 1800s, the best czars were Alexander the First, who fought against Napoleon, and then Alexander II and Alexander III. Three Alexanders were the best czars. They all the same name. It's just funny.
Yeah, let's get on to colonization or imperialism, I guess. We'll get to this a little more in the next one, but basically, this period, a lot of imperialism focuses on the continent of Africa, which had kind of been southern Africa beyond the Saharas, I should say, which had kind of been ignored in previous generations, other than the slave trade. But even with the slave trade, they didn't colonize it. They just, kind of purchased slaves from a lot of, African, warlords or stuff like that, and then kind of took them. But at this point, they sort of wanted, mostly because of the natural resources they used them to fuel kind of industrialization. A lot of countries began what's called the Scramble for Africa, and that was identified in the Berlin Conference, where there's kind of an agreement over how to divide Africa.
Yeah, no. At this point, there's so much power in Europe that they just kind of meet and they're like, oh, let's divide Africa. They have that much leisure with their control over an entire continent.
And probably one of the worst examples of just morally of what happened in Africa was Belgian Congo. So what happened there, it's kind of interesting in not that it was not colonized by saying Belgium now owns the country. It was literally Leopold I just declared the entirety of what is known today as the Democratic Republic of the Congo his personal property, basically. And then he said, he was going to, help make this land modern. He did like humanitarian language to help the people there.
Yeah, but keep in mind, it's a smaller region than, like, it's not the Republic of Congo. It's the Democratic Republic.
Yeah, it's a really big.
No, it's sorry. It's the other way around. It's the Republic of Congo. It's not the Democratic Republic of the Congo, because that area was considered Ethiopia at the time, and Ethiopia was never officially colonized at this period.
The Congo? Are you talking about? No, Ethiopia wasn't, at least until Mussolini wasn't invaded.
No, it was called Ethiopia, but it wasn't colonized until Mussolini. But this is the thing: is that the region that was called the Congo back then was a lot smaller than it is now.
It was mostly focused on the river area, but even then, basically they committed heavy atrocities on the kind of the locals, kind of like forced them to make these quotas of rubber, and if they didn't, they would kill them or maim them, and it was so bad, even other European imperialists denounced Leopold for what he did.
Yeah, no, he was, and to be fair, Belgium was a country that had been separated from the Netherlands in 1830 after Napoleon.
I wanted to show its power.
It kind of it had to make a name for itself, and it did it in a very disgusting way.
And there was also idea India was under the British still then. It was mostly kind of tranquil, except for 1857. There was a rebellion by a lot of the kind of the British own troops thing, because of, they said one of their gunpowder things was laced with pork, and that was against the Hindu kind of thing, so they rebelled. But that was kind of at least until we get to the 20th century, one of the only major acts of resistance to British rule.
Yeah, I mean, there's I think we can wrap up now.
But yeah, one more. Did we talk about the Opium War? Okay.
Yeah, you can go for it. Yeah, actually, I was wrong. I want to say I was wrong. The Congo region was actually, and I should know this because I read King Leopold's Ghost. I read this book, so I should know this. But you're right, Evan. The area is very big. That was called the Congo. It's the same as it is now, basically. Yeah. Very big area.
But this was kind of a little earlier then, but it still remains a colonization. So China was never colonized, really, but there was a heavy trade, and there was kind of disagreements over countries on which could trade with China. Britain became the dominant, especially when they took Hong Kong. But they actually had a war with China called the Opium War, and what happened then was they wanted to sell opium to China to kind of get more money and kind of they could use to fund further activities. And China, kind of like the opioid epidemic today, didn't want them selling it because they said, it was poisoning our citizens, and so they actually fought wars to continue selling it.
Yeah, and I heard somewhere, and I don't have the facts with me, but I heard somewhere that roughly 90% of the adult male population under 40 was addicted to opium during this war, or leading right up to it.
Okay, but that should wrap up like this thing. In the next chapter, we'll get from 1885. So we'll get into the kind of later days of colonization and the social changes leading up to World War One.
Yeah, which is it doesn't sound like a big deal, but World War One, we're going to see the downfall of the aristocracy in Europe almost completely. So it's a pretty big change. All right,
That should wrap up today.
sounds good.
Okay.
You don't have to.